Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar from the Global CCS Institute. My name is Gareth Lloyd and I will chair this webinar. I'm delighted to introduce you to our speakers on our panel in the Netherlands. The topic is transportation and storage economics of CCS networks in the Netherlands, and I will go through a couple of arrangements in a moment after I introduce the speakers about how we take questions, which we are very pleased to encourage. First of all, Ernst Menton from the Rotterdam Climate Initiative, Delta Links. Ernst is a project manager for Delta Links Energy Forum, has been involved in the field of CCS since 2010. In the role, he's been RCI's project leader for this study on CO2 transport and storage economics of CCS networks in the Netherlands, as well as the independent storage assessment, which identified the most appropriate short and long-term CO2 storage options in the Dutch continental shelf. Ernst holds degrees in environmental and medical biology and has had a long career in the field of climate change mitigation. Titania Zervos is also on our panel. She's from the Clean Energy Clinton Climate Initiative. Titania is a project manager in the Clean Energy team at Clinton Climate Initiative, focusing mostly on CCS in Europe and China. Under the CCI's Memorandum of Understanding with the Rotterdam Climate Initiative, she's been advising the RCI and working closely with all the emitters considering CCS projects in the Netherlands towards the planning of a CCS network, and has led the financial modelling for this report. She's also involved in CCS and more general climate finance issues, including through the CCUS Action Group and the UK's Capital Market Climate Initiative. Titania holds an MA in Economics and Management from the University of Oxford, and prior to joining CCI was an associate in the Investment Banking Division of Bank of America Merrill Lynch in London. Daniel Luther. Daniel is from Petroleum Geosciences, TNO. He's a research scientist for Petroleum Geosciences team at TNO. He's been working in the E&P industry for 5 years and has a particular interest in reservoir engineering, assisted history matching and CO2 storage. He's involved in several European projects and national studies related to CO2 storage and transport. These studies include storage capacity estimation, CO2 monitoring, and related chemical and geomechanical analysis. Daniel was a member of the developer team of the ECO tool, which was an economic evaluation tool of CO2 storage projects. Specifically, Daniel was responsible for the cost estimates and the modelling of different CCS infrastructures in the North Sea built into the ECO tool. So welcome to our panelists, and I'll be handing over to them in a moment, but first of all, just a point about how to collect, put your questions into our system. What we'd like you to do is put your questions in the little box on the screen there. We'll be collecting those questions during the presentation, so just write them in as you find things arise. We'll be asking our presenters to go through the whole presentation, and then I will put the questions to the panel. So please submit them directly, and we will actually often combine one or two questions if they're almost the same, but I will go through them like that to make sure that we make best use of our time. So that's the arrangement for the questions, and we do very much welcome that because it makes the webinar much more interesting for everybody concerned. So at this point, I will hand over to Ernst Menton to get started. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gareth. Good morning. Good morning. It's at least morning in the Netherlands. My name is Ernst Menton, and I would like to welcome you to our presentation on the transport and storage economic study of CCS networks in the Netherlands and in Belgium. We worked for a large part of 2012 on this project and finalized it in the first quarter of this year. The report and the accompanying public model is available for download from the website of the Institute, and from the website of the Rotterdam Climate Initiative. Before we go into the content, I would very much to thank our contributors who made this project possible. They are, next to the Global CCS Institute, the Rotterdam Climate Initiative, Co2, the Dutch National R&D Program on CCS, Stichting Borg, Antwerp Port Authority, and Shell. The delivery team consisted, in addition to the people who are presenting here today, of Philip Naylor from TNO, and Chris Hendricks and Joris Korneve from Ecofis. The agenda for this presentation is as follows. First, we highlight some background and introduce the objectives for this project and how we organized it. We describe how we went about in generating scenarios on which we did the analysis and how we collected the data and cost figures. After that, the financial model will be described, and we end the presentation with the key takeaways and some recommendations from the steering group. At the end of this session, there will be room for questions, as you just heard. We start with the objectives and the way we organized the project. In early 2012, we saw that there was a number of industry-led initiatives planning for large-scale demonstration projects in Rotterdam, as well as in Eemshaven, which lays in the north of the Netherlands, and in the port of Antwerp in Belgium. Those early projects developed a vision for a commercial deployment of CO2 transport, which were based on common user networks. We also saw that the second round of NERC 300 program was planned for late 2012, early 2013, so companies willing to apply would need to take short-term decisions on the design of their CO2 infrastructure. Furthermore, there was an opportunity to collectively evaluate alternative pathways with those emitters in the Netherlands that are the most committed to develop CCS projects. We had already worked with them in a previous project called the Independent Storage Assessment. Under these emitters are companies like E.ON, Electrobel, Shell, Air Liquide, Ascent, and Air Products. They agreed to function as a steering group for this project, and in turn were able to form a common view on the cost and risk drivers of CO2 transport and storage options on a shared basis. This was one of the objectives of the project and led to a confidential financial model presented to them. The other objective was to identify actions that could enhance the feasibility of CCS projects and provide a basis for strategic and commercial discussions. The project organization. At first, we developed a number of scenarios based on offshore storage options that would seem likely in the short and medium term. For the short term, we focused on demo projects that were already in development, so they could provide us with realistic project details. We called that phase 1, and we worked on that with the Dutch emitters from Rotterdam and Eemshaven. The storage locations were P18, P15, Q1, and an EOR opportunity in Denmark. It was all in the North Sea. In phase 2, we focused on the midterm possibilities and the international storage options in Q1, Southern North Sea, off the coast of Scotland, and in Norway. I will come to a detailed description later. We needed a lot of data, and preferably data that originated from real projects. Therefore, we talked to all companies who are aware at that time working on CCS projects in the Rotterdam area. Next to that, we used publicly available information, for example, the Institute's report on the economic assessment of CCS technologies. We also generated detailed injection profiles to be used in the scenario calculations and integrated all of that into the ECHO tool. This tool generated yearly CAPEX and OPEX figures for each part of the transport and storage chain studied. Daniel will explain this later. We then built a dynamic Excel-based discounted cash flow model to assess economics of each scenario and determine the overall risk-reward profile of those scenarios. After these modeling steps, we were able to identify the most important cost drivers, get an idea of the total and per unit cost to the emitters, and the cash flows and rates of return for the operators of the chain and the chain units. The last part of our project consisted of the transfer of knowledge, of which this webinar is part of, and resulted in the publication of our report and the public model on the website I mentioned earlier. We also engaged with the key stakeholders in the steering group to discuss the conclusions and the implications we could draw from the findings. We will discuss these at the end of our presentation. We would now like to discuss the building of the scenarios and the collecting of the data. Before I will hand over the microphone to Daniel, I would like to explain the rationale for the storage options we used. In this project, we worked backwards from the storage location to the CO2 sources. In phase 1, we focused on actual projects which could be realized in the short term in the Netherlands. In phase 2, we focused on mid-term possibilities, typically from 2020 and onwards, with an international perspective. The P18, P15 cluster consists of nearly depleted gas fields approximately 20 kilometers off the coast of Rotterdam and is ideally situated for storing CO2 cost-effectively. It can best be reached by pipeline. The field is under consideration of the road project, and at the time was by green hydrogen. As you may know, this last project unfortunately stopped. The Den oil field is an opportunity for enhanced oil recovery and was a long time under consideration by green hydrogen to take CO2 transported by ship. It's in a good position to handle CO2 from Rotterdam as well as from Eemshaven. The Q1 field is an aquifer in the central part of the Dutch continental shelf and identified as the most promising medium-term storage site. We modeled the CO2 transport via ship and pipeline coming from Rotterdam, Eemshaven, and Antwerp. These three options were part of scenarios studied in the first phase of the project. In phase 2, we focused on the international scenarios, though for comparison also Q1 was used. We modeled the Bunter aquifer, which is a huge aquifer likely to store CO2 from the Yorkshire region and relatively easy accessible from Rotterdam and Antwerp. Also, the Captain Sandstone aquifer was used, which was identified as the most promising storage location in Scottish waters and accessible from all three regions studied. And at last, we worked with the Utsira Sandstone Formation in Norway, which is a very huge aquifer, which already takes up 1 million tons of CO2 each year. It's best accessed from Eemshaven by ship. I would now like to hand over the microphone to Daniel Louve from TNO to explain more on how we worked with the scenarios and the data gathering.
And thank you. Thank you. We'll go to the next slide. As you could see on the previous slide, the transport options are ship or pipeline to the storage location, and the choice between those two options are not always very obvious, as for example for the Bunter aquifer in the southern North Sea. The location of the Bunter aquifer is shown in the left figure and is just in the middle of the black box. A close-up of this black box is shown on the right side, where you can see the different transport options shown there. Here the blue lines are two pipelines modeled from the Rotterdam Antwerp region and will go onshore on the UK and then will be redirected by an offshore pipeline to the UK Bunter aquifer. Another scenario is the red line, where a ship will arrive at the harbor and then an onshore pipeline will go via the hub to the aquifer and will be stored there. So there are two options to model. But the question is now, which mode of transport is the most cost effective? Is it ship or is it pipeline? In order to answer questions like these, we use the ECHO tool. The ECHO tool is a software package to do techno-economic analysis of CO2 capture, transport, and storage. And the aim of the tool is to assess economic feasibility of CCS value chains from the actor point of view, but also from the government point of view. The tool is able to model key performance indicators, for example, CAPEX and OPEX time series, and these are based on physics and also on cost input parameters. I will come back on these later. But to come back to the question raised on the slide, we compared the cost for shipping and pipelines for the various scenarios by using the Echo tool. An example is the difference of the cost for shipping and pipeline on this figure. So on the top we have the cost of shipping, and on the bottom we have the cost of pipeline. On the horizontal axis you will see the annual CO2 transported in megaton per year, and the vertical is distance. As you can see, the ship is especially more cost effective in the longer distances, above 250 kilometers, and in the relatively small volumes, let's say between 0 and 5 megatons. For a higher annual CO2 transport, pipeline becomes more cost effective. One should keep in mind that a figure like this is very case specific and depends very much on the assumptions used. For example, the number of crossings, a high pressure or a low pressure pipeline, the total period of operation, etc., etc. So no general conclusion can be drawn from a figure like this here. So once decided on the mode of transport, we can design the specific scenario in more detail. In this slide, there's a schematic overview of one of the scenarios we developed during our project. The design and the volumes transported by the individual emitters were established in close cooperation with the steering group committee mentioned earlier. So let's have a look in more detail to this scenario. Here on the top right, we have the Eemshaven with two North Netherlands demo and full-scale projects, which will go to the Q1 aquifer here on the left-hand side. In the demo phase, the transport mode will go by shipping. In the full-scale phase, a pipeline will transport CO2 to the Q1 aquifer. From the Rotterdam area, in this scenario, there are two full-scale projects which go via a hub by 10 megaton new offshore pipeline to the Q1 aquifer offshore in the Netherlands. Then from the Antwerp region, we developed two types of scenarios. One by an onshore pipeline connecting to the Rotterdam collection network and then going to the new offshore pipeline to the Q1 aquifer, scenario A, and the other scenario, scenario B, is direct shipping from the Antwerp region to the Q1 aquifer. So on this slide, we have many so-called chain units. So pipeline, ships, storage locations, a hub, terminals, they are all chain units which has to be modeled individually with technical and cost and economic parameters which has to be inserted, which I will go in more detail on the next slide. So for example, here for a pipeline, I have an input format for a chain unit for a pipeline. So technical details like the pipeline route, size, the length, high pressure, terrain, onshore, offshore, the material used, but also more economical values, the costings and also the indexations are implemented here. And the Echo tool will use those to create CAPEX and OPEX time series. This is done for every single chain unit. So for the shipping and also for the storage, there are geological parameters used where in the end inactivity is calculated. The Echo tool will use this and the CAPEX and OPEX time series are calculated, which will be used in the financial model later. In order to fill in all these details, we have to collect data from existing public sources, but also from confidential reports available to the steering group, like the independent source assessment 1, 2, and 3. We also had one-on-one meetings with certain steering group members to check our cost estimates of the ECHO tool, and finally they also recognized our cost estimates itself. Well, in the end, we have the ECHO tool produces CAPEX and OPEX time series and also CO2 throughput time series of all the chain units mentioned before, and these will serve as an input for the financial model, which we'll discuss in the next slide by Tatjana. So I would like to hand over the microphone to Tatjana to discuss the financial model in more detail.
Thank you, Daniel. I will now talk a little bit about the financial model. With the scenarios, the technical parameters, and all the cost data set, our next step in this project was to build a financial model, or what our steering group called the planning tool. This was nothing more than just a standard discounted cash flow model, but it allowed us to compare the different options and also identify the most important value drivers. In terms of the structure, what we followed was a bottoms-up approach. So, as Daniel explained previously, each scenario was broken down into individual chain units. So, for example, individual onshore pipelines in Rotterdam, or offshore pipelines from Rotterdam to the Q1 storage site, or the storage sites in the UK. In the financial model, these individual chain units were grouped into operators based on our understanding of the most likely ownership arrangements, and these operators were assumed to provide a service, a paid service, to the individual emitters. The key inputs of the model are firstly the capital and operating cost time series that were produced by the ECHO tool, and those were broken down into individual CAPEX and OPEX line items, including fixed and variable OPEX. Assumptions relating to the financing package that each operator is likely to secure. So, for example, what is the mix between debt and equity, the likely tenor of the debt, and the related costs. In addition, we layered on assumptions relating to the type of tariffs that could be agreed between emitters on the one hand and operators of the transport and storage infrastructure on the other. So here we looked at the extent to which tariffs would include an availability or take-or-pay component in addition to a per ton CO2 tariff. And finally, we also included assumptions relating to the timing and the scale of each emitter's capture operations. So based on all these inputs, for a specific scenario, the model estimates the future cash flows of the individual operators, so for a collection of pipelines, for example, on an annual basis. And then it solves for a tariff that would be charged to each emitter in order to meet the operator's targeted returns and cover costs and other assumptions. So, for example, the total cost of offtake for an emitter in Rotterdam could be broken down into a tariff for, firstly, the transport from its fence to the shoreline, the transport in the offshore pipeline to the storage site, and also the cost of storage itself. And that would include injection as well as abandonment considerations. So, as you can see, this tool considered 3 different perspectives. So in terms of output, we had outputs that referred to the scenario as a whole, unit and total cost, outputs relating to the transport and storage operators in detailed financial statements, and also the outputs relating to the payments of each emitter at the start of the chain. In these next couple of slides, I just wanted to give you a little bit more detail on the type of output the planning tool can produce. So on the table on the top left, we have a summary of the technical parameters and headline costs for the transport and storage operator for a particular scenario. I think this is our international scenario number 2. The table on the bottom right is a snapshot of a cash flow statement for each of the pipeline operators in this particular scenario. Of course, the tool goes into a lot more detail in terms of the output. So we can provide a full income statement, cash flow statement, with data provided annually for the life of the project. And also the financing mix can be quite detailed. In addition to debt and equity, we can also model capital grants, another form of public subsidies. From the point of view of the emitters, the key output was the tariff that they would have to pay each operator in a specific scenario, given assumptions on their capture rates and scale of their operations, as well as the assumptions on the targeted returns for the operators. The chart on the top gives you an indication of these results. So within a scenario, the vertical range, the vertical bar, indicates differences in costs charged to different emitters within the scenario. And these are primarily driven by differences in their own volumes and timing. So, of course, the results are all very much specific to the individual assumptions, but in general, the tariffs were lowest for sort of higher CO2 volume emitters, preferably using the least amount of infrastructure, and where there was also the least amount of inefficiency in the overall offtake system. So where the pipelines and storage reservoirs were used to capacity. We also ran some sensitivity analyses on some of the cost drivers. So in addition to playing with assumptions on the CO2 volumes and timing, we also looked at the financing mix by adding a capital grant component, which is the chart on the left, and also played around with the cost of the financing itself, so changing our weighted average cost of capital assumptions. And the objective here was mainly to determine how sensitive tariffs were to certain assumptions. What we found during this exercise was that for many emitters in our steering group, the economics of a shared transport and storage option, transport and storage system, hadn't been properly quantified before, and this valuation exercise was overall quite well received. So we therefore wanted to develop a more simplified version of the model to share with other regions. And this is now available on the Institute's website. The public model, as we call it, is structured in a very similar way to the planning tool that was delivered to the steering group, and has the flexibility in relation to assumptions on financing, again, determining the types of tariffs that would be charged to emitters, and what and the outputs in terms of the financial statements and emitter tariffs. Just for convenience, it has been preset with a few example cases based on the cost data available in the Institute's economic assessment of CCS technologies reports of a few years ago. But all the cost estimates can be easily excuse me, adapted to reflect specific project data. If you would like to amend the inputs. They've also made available a user manual for the model, and that gives a step-by-step explanation of how to work with the model and function each worksheet. And that is also available on the Institute's website. So we're now in the final section of this presentation, and we would like to discuss some of the key takeaways from the analysis, as well as the steering group's thoughts on what needs to be done to resolve some of the stumbling blocks facing CCS in this region, as well as our own advice to other projects or regions wanting to replicate this project. In terms of the analysis itself, we were happy to report that our steering group found this useful to compare and contrast different sets of options, and also narrow in on issues such as the choice of transport mode, pipeline versus ship, issues relating to oversizing and design of network systems, and also sort of an insight into possible commercial and financial arrangements. For some emitters in the group, it might also serve as a reference for a second round NER 300 application. So the costs were overall recognized as realistic, both the cost of the infrastructure and the range of tariffs. Our analysis confirmed that sharing infrastructure is the way forward, and it makes sense from an economic perspective. So, for example, if we were to take an over-dimensioned pipeline, we found that a doubling of the CO2 volumes in terms of throughput from, say, 20% to 40% of the pipeline's capacity could lead to savings in transport costs of around 70% and saving in storage costs of about 20%. But that, of course, one of the main conclusions is that it requires coordination of the first mover and follow-on CCS projects in the region. We also found from a technical geological perspective that storage costs can be reduced when CO2 is injected close to the maximum injectivity level of the reservoir. But careful consideration needs to be made during the injection, as this is a function of the physics, and it's quite a dynamic process. And this, of course, also requires a call for coordination over the CO2 streams in the network. In terms of the CCS directive, while we didn't include CO2 liabilities in this exercise, there is, of course, a requirement for monitoring, measurements, and verification for storage for up to 20 years after the end of injection in the current version of the directive. And we found that MMV can contribute between 4 and 13% of the overall cost to an emitter, depending on the lifetime and duration of the project. In terms of the choice of transport, in a situation where there is no sort of planned project, so more of a greenfield context, as Daniel mentioned, the shipping appeared to be more efficient for lower volumes and longer distances. However, this is quite case specific, so we wouldn't want to generalize too much about this conclusion. As for the financing, as we would have expected, the effect of any government contribution, particularly of a capital grant, appeared to be higher in terms of infrastructure that had a higher proportion of capital costs in relation to operating costs. So, for example, pipeline operators tended to be, or the pipeline activities tended to be a lot more sensitive to changing the capital structure than, for example, storage. I will now hand this over back to Ernst, and he can run through the steering group's recommendations as well as some practical advice for other regions.
Okay, thank you, Tatjana. Yes, at the end of this project, we discussed the findings with the steering group, and we tried to assess what should be done to stimulate companies to become active in the CCS field. And we came to 4 conclusions, which I would like to take you through now. The first point is that the investment climate has to be stimulated. ETS is at present sends no signals, no positive signals at least, so the government should step in with an overall plan on how to mobilize other stakeholders. The plan should have a clear focus on CCS, and possibly government could also mobilize state-owned companies like EBN and GasUnie, which are state-owned companies in the Netherlands. Another point is that, a very important point, is that also that governments should ensure the availability of storage locations. When CCS will start growing, there will also be a need for more storage space. The government owns the seabed and thus the storage locations within it. And as we learned from the independent storage assessment, the project we did earlier, there were few possible aquifers in the Dutch continental shelf. The characterization of such a storage location takes 7 to 10 years, and government therefore needs to start investigating the possibilities now. And it should also be investigated whether government could create a kind of storage-ready certification for these sites. There also is a need for government to work together with private parties. On the one hand, we see that sharing infrastructure is very cost-effective, but therefore one needs to start with oversizing. This implies that a first mover has higher costs and risks than later joiners. Somehow this should be mitigated. Maybe a way to that is that government can also play a role in the financing of the infrastructure. We see a parallel with bridges and railroads. Government could be a party in the construction of CCS infrastructure and collect a transport fee to get its money back. Also, in the shared networks, there is the issue of CO2 specifications. There is a need for a standard on CO2 streams with a certain bandwidth. And the last point of the steering group is the cooperation between parties on CCS that needs to be revitalized and focused on the broader picture on how can we develop multiple full-scale CCS projects. In the Netherlands, there was a national task force on CCS, and that should be reinstalled in order to create a collective voice and identify and solve key issues. And this should also include government. Also, the dialogue with the European Union could be channeled better. Regions like Rotterdam, Eemshaven, and possibly Antwerp can and should work together to address their issues in Brussels. In our last slide, we provide some practical advice to other regions who are thinking of also doing this kind of modeling studies. And we draw 4 practical advice points for them. The first point is that stakeholder coordination and engagement is key. The first thing you should do is to arrange a platform in order to generate stakeholder inputs throughout the project. Stakeholders can also provide valuable project information. Furthermore, the objectives should be clear from the beginning. The questions to be answered should be collectively formulated together with the stakeholders. And when you develop scenarios, make sure to base them on the most realistic CCS plans available in your region. Collect all the relevant information you can get your hands on. The more realistic the input, the more realistic the outcome will be. We now come to the end of our presentation, and I would like to hand over the lead to the institutes. Please, Garrett.
Thank you very much, Ernst. And I'm going to take questions now, and thank you very much to our panel. So I'll address your questions to the panel, and we can still take more questions. So if there are things that come to mind now, please put them into the little box shown on your screen, and we'll do our best to manage them in the time. So I'm going to kick off with a question to the panel, which is, are the steering group members on the same page regarding future developments of CCS?
Thank you, Garrett. I would like to answer on that. Yes, the steering group members are, as you can imagine, in different phases of their development. There are parties in the Netherlands which are long time being pursuing to start a project, and there are parties who are thinking about it. But when we discussed the situation CCS developments are in now in the Netherlands and also in Western Europe, they are definitely on the same page regarding what should be done, and that was what we that was our last 4 slides. We mentioned that, and yeah, well, there's a collective image on that.
Thank you. And that brings me to the next question, which you touched on, but how does this project fit in to the NER 300 second round process?
Well, the NER 300 second round process should be launched a few months ago already, but it's now being postponed to July this year. So this fits in nicely. The model is available, and yeah, companies can use it whether they like it, whenever they like.
And you mentioned the first mover disadvantage. What's your opinion on that, and how to deal with it in the best way?
Well, I think I'm happy to take this one. I think the basis for this project was really to quantify that that risk of oversizing a network and then not having that vision executed, and additional projects following being implemented after the first mover. So what this project served to do was to quantify that risk in numbers, in a cost and a tariff for the first movers. But I think there continues to be room for further analysis on the type of commercial arrangements and incentives that could be developed for the first movers to mitigate their additional risk for taking that first step.
Okay. And another question probably for you, can the public financial model that is available on the Global Institute's website be used actually without the ECHO tool?
Absolutely, and that was the purpose of building a separate model, was that we faced some confidentiality issues with the underlying data for the planning tool. So we developed a separate model using public information from the Institute's economic assessment reports. And in plain terms, the main cost inputs there are a total CAPEX and OPEX figures for a pipeline or a storage location. So users of the model are more than welcome to update those cost figures based on their own data, or even to reflect sort of, their specific project parameters. So it's completely independent of the ECHO tool, at the moment based on public information, but can be adapted to user preferences.
Okay, thank you. And what are some of the main financial risks and uncertainties for permanent storage of CO2 in the Netherlands and in the EU?
I suppose one of the components that we deliberately did not include in our modeling was actually the issue of CO2 liabilities. And this was because we had quite a big debate within the steering group as to how you would actually price the liabilities. And there is a recommendation or a guidance provided by the Commission. But in the end, the group decided that it's probably easier to not consider that the issue of the CO2 liabilities at this moment and focus really on the pure technical costs. So I think the issue of the liabilities is probably a follow-on project or an additional study that can be done rather independently of this. But in terms of the overall costs of storage, we did look into the preparation of the site, which included characterization, the cost of injection, as well as abandonment and proper abandonment and sealing of the wells.
Thank you. Another finance question, we have a lot of these. Shared transport and storage infrastructure may require initial investments in what would be oversized pipelines. How could you raise finance for such infrastructure? Or in other words, which parties are likely to bear these initial costs?
That is a good question. So indeed, in this model, what we looked at was oversized infrastructure. So the premise was that certain projects that are currently being built and planned in the Netherlands were planned with a vision for a network. So the pipelines and the storage sites that we've chosen in our scenarios all have that oversized, overdimensioned baked in. In terms of the financing, what we chose to do, instead of looking at it as an integrated transport and storage project, we actually broke down the assumptions relating to finance for individual pipeline operators versus shipping operators versus storage, so that the individual operators could be financed differently. So the intention here was to bring down the risk to the individual, to match the individual profiles of the types of infrastructure, rather than to roll up the risk to the highest common denominator, which would most likely be the storage component. So the tool, and this is also true for the public model, allows you to change the financing assumptions for the individual components, so that you could choose, for example, a lower rate of return on equity, for example, for the pipeline, which would be like any standard gas transport, relative to, for example, the storage, which is likely to be more risky. So we've left that open to discussion in terms of the most appropriate rates and terms. We've done this based on certain discussions that the Clinton Climate Initiative has had with both project developers and financiers in Europe and Australia. But the assumptions are fully flexible and can be changed by both the steering group and also in the public model.
Okay, thank you. And has the cost of CO2 storage been affected significantly by any technical or physical parameter requirements? And if so, which parameters are most important?
Well, for storage, for example, the inactivity is very important, and one of the things what happens if you have, for example, 10 megaton going to a storage site and the inactivity is too low, an additional well has to be drilled, and this can be a significant additional capex to the whole storage cost. So there's an example for an additional cost, but it really depends on the storage location or properties itself. So it cannot be general for every storage site, but it's case specific.
Okay, and how did the lifetime of the transport infrastructure influence the tariffs?
Sorry, what was that? What is the what timing factor?
How did the lifetime of the transport infrastructure actually influence the tariffs charged?
Right. Okay. So I suppose the scenarios were built in relation to. So we chose a storage location, understood the potential capacity and lifetime of the storage site, and then developed the transport based on obviously the capture operations and linking the timing to the storage. So in terms of the lifetime, you would expect that to the extent that you can use a pipeline and you would expend CapEx in the first year, but if you were to only use that pipeline, say, for 10 years, the tariff would probably be higher if there is no salvage value or no useful use of the pipeline after that 10-year period of the project. And that is different to a scenario where the lifetime of the transport or that pipeline is, say, 30 years. So it gives the operator of the pipeline a longer time frame over which to recover its capital and to meet its return target.
Okay, and do the tariffs presented in the report actually incorporate a profit margin, or are they actually aimed at cost recovery?
They do incorporate a profit margin. So the tariffs are effectively solving for the price that the transport and storage operators would need to set to cover the costs and also meet a return on equity requirement in the case of the pipelines and the ship of, say, 10%, and in the case of storage of around 13%. But again, as I mentioned before, that's a flexible assumption.
Yeah, and what methods were considered for apportioning or distributing costs and capacity amongst infrastructure users?
That was based on, so each scenario had a preset assumptions in terms of the volumes of CO2 captured by each individual emitter in that scenario. So the costs were apportioned depending on the volumes and timing of the CO2 capture operations in that particular scenario.
And last question is, the projects often seek capital grants. However, do operating grants actually achieve similar impacts?
I would argue that they probably, you would probably need both. So to the extent that you would probably have to look at the proportion of the capital and operating cost in terms of the total cost. So a capital grant has been the most common form of support from the European Commission to date. And so for more capital-intensive elements such as, you know, the building of a pipeline or a terminal, that could be efficient. But in the case of storage, actually having an operating component or a performance-based subsidy might actually be more suited, because the operating costs of injection make up a larger component than the capital costs for preparing the site and abandoning the site.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I'm conscious of time and the time slot that we have. We've actually received a lot more questions than we've been able to answer, even though your panel has been working very hard through all of those. So thank you to them. We will actually aim to answer all of them via email. So you'll see on the screen our contact details, and our team here will be pleased to do that. I'm very pleased to thank our presenters and them for all of their work in presenting this and also answering those questions. So Ernst Menton, Daniel Lufer, and Tatiana Zervos, thank you very much on behalf of the audience and the Institute. And thank you for all of the questions to our audience, and it's been a lively session. The full report and the financial model that we've been talking about just now are all on the website. You can see the link there. And again, put any feedback through or extra questions on the webinar. There's a short survey that as you close this. We hope you found it very useful. We do like to get your feedback also on the need for other webinars on similar topics that we should cover. So in closing, please make use of those resources on our website. I thank again our panelists for their time and our audience for their involvement. Thank you very much for your questions. Thank you.